And first were the endless tens or hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of written history and drama. The twin practices of delay and exchange began to emerge slowly and painfully. Then they became represented in metaphorical abstraction as rituals and tales of sacrifice. It's as if there's a powerful figure in the sky who's judging you. You better keep him happy or look the hell out. We've been watching ourselves deal with him for a long time. He seems to like it when you give up something you value. So practice sharing and sacrificing until you get good at it. No one actually said any of this so long ago, although they said something very similar. But it was implicit in the practice and then in the stories. Action comes first. Implicit comes first. People watched the successful succeed and the unsuccessful fail for thousands and thousands of years, and we thought it over and we drew a conclusion. The successful among us sacrifice. The successful among us delay gratification. The successful among us bargain with the future. And then a great idea begins to emerge in ever more articulated form. That idea is the point of a long and profound story. It's the moral of the story. And I'm going to engage in some foreshadowing here. What's the difference between the successful and the unsuccessful? The successful sacrifice, and things get better as the successful practice their sacrifices. The question becomes increasingly precise and simultaneously broader. What is the greatest possible sacrifice for the greatest possible good? You know, if you push a question in a direction, perhaps there comes a time when you can't formulate it any more precisely and broadly, and that's the point at which the question, in some sense, and perhaps even the answer, the question becomes archetypal. It becomes archetypal because it can't be bested. And this is like an ultimate question in some sense. How are you going to ask a more broad-based question than that? What is, given the initial presuppositions that you have to make sacrifices, then the logical endpoint to that is something like, okay, if you have to make a sacrifice, what's the greatest possible sacrifice and for the greatest possible good? That's a good question. The answer becomes increasingly profound. The God of Western tradition, like so many gods, requires sacrifice. We've already examined why, but sometimes he goes even further and requires the sacrifice of what is loved best. This is why. And this is another one of mankind's fundamental discoveries. Sometimes things do not go well. That's self-evident. But here's the rub. Sometimes when things are not going well, it's precisely that which is most valued that is the cause. Why? It's because the world is revealed through the template of your values. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore, it's time to examine your values. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. There's a famous experiment that I've alluded to a couple of times, I believe, in this lecture series, the invisible gorilla experiment. And in the invisible gorilla experiment, there's two teams of players, each with 3 members, one dressed in black and the other dressed in white, and each team is passing a basketball back and forth to the team members and milling about. You see a video of them doing so. They basically fill the video screen, and the white team is passing a basketball to the white team members, and the black team is passing a basketball to the black team members, and your job, as far as the experimenter is concerned, is for you to count the number of times that the black team passes the basketball back and forth. So that's what you do. So now you have an ambition and an aim and a value. And the ambition and the aim and the value, they're all the same thing, and that is to perform well at the task. Now, the thing that's so cool about this, and this is really so cool, it's just unbelievable that this is the case. It's like a complete validation of a certain element of the Buddhist worldview. So they pass the ball for a couple of minutes, and then the experimenter says to you, how many? And you say 15, and because you're happy with yourself because you've been paying attention, and the experimenter says, yeah, that's right, or maybe not, maybe you missed one. And then the experimenter says, did you see the gorilla? And half of you say, what gorilla? Like, really? And the experimenter says, yes. And then he rewinds it and plays the video, and like a minute and a half into the 3-minute video, sure enough, in walks this guy in a gorilla suit, 6'3" or so, stands in the middle of the game, right in the middle of the game, the same size as the players, perfectly, obviously evident, beats his chest for like a second and a half, and then sort of saunters off. And half the people who watch the video don't see the gorilla, which is absolutely shocking. And what that means is that your ambitions blind you to the nature of reality. Now, they illuminate some reality, but they blind you to most of it. And that's fine, because there's not a lot of you in some ways. You're a very pinpoint thing, like a laser beam. And so you just can't be attending to everything all the time. But one of the things that you might ask yourself once you know that is that if you're suffering dreadfully, then one possibility is that you're so fixed on the point, the fact that you're so fixed on the point that you're fixed on might be integrally related to why things are going so catastrophically wrong. Now, perhaps not, because, there's a lot of arbitrariness about life. And perhaps you suffer even when you don't deserve to. That seems to happen in the book of Job, for example, because Job is a good guy, and God has a bet with Satan, which seems like another relatively nasty thing to do, to let Satan just torture him, and he does quite nicely, to see if he'll turn against God. And it seems like a rather playground sort of thing for God to engage in. But the point is that even in a document like the Old Testament, there's ample suggestion that sometimes people just get wiped out and hurt, even if they're living good moral lives, aiming properly and all that. There's an arbitrariness in life that's not eradicable. But it's possible that it's what you're clinging to that's hurting you. And it's even possible that it's the thing that you're clinging to the hardest that's hurting you the most. That could easily be someone you love. Like, lots of times I see people in therapy and they're miserable for one reason or another. And sometimes it's because they have a very close relationship with a family member, and that just isn't working. The family member, for the sake of simplicity, we'll say, is not really oriented towards helping them have a good life. The family member is instead oriented towards making them as bloody miserable as you can possibly make anyone. And what would you say? Exploiting the bond between family members in order to enable that. And then sometimes the sacrifice that's necessary is either merely distancing yourself from that person, sometimes substantively, and sometimes seriously distancing yourself from them, like, we don't talk anymore, ever. And so that's pretty damn rough, and it hurts and all of that. But it's a good example of the fact that sometimes, in order to extract yourself from the miserable bit of chaos that you happen to be enmeshed in, you have to let go of what you love best. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore it's time to examine your values. It's really worth thinking about, because the alternative too is to curse fate, right? Because if it isn't you, and there's nothing you can do to change, there isn't something you're doing that's wrong, then it's fate itself, it's the world itself, it's other people, let's say, because they're a huge part of the world, or it's the nature of the world itself, or it's God himself in whatever form you either believe in or don't believe in, because it's fundamentally all the same in the sort of situation that I'm describing. So, and one of the things that's really interesting, and I mentioned this before about the Israelites in the Old Testament, is that they got this right. It's really something, because what happens to the Israelites over and over in the Old Testament is that they get all puffed up about how wonderful they are, and then they make moral errors because they're arrogant, and then God comes along and just cuts them into pieces for like generation after generation, and then they wobble back to their feet, but they always maintain the same attitude, which is, we did something wrong. We did something wrong. It's like an axiom, rather than observation, is that if things are not laying themselves out for us as they should be, then we cannot curse God. We have to look to ourselves. Well, and you think, well, why not curse God? Because maybe it's his fault. And that's a really good question. And one of the things that I've tried to figure out over the last 30 years is, well, why not just curse God? Because there is this arbitrary element to existence, and we are vulnerable, and there is plenty of suffering, and things are unfair. Like, there's problems, right? There's injustice and unfairness and all of these things, and endless suffering. So why not just lay it at the feet of God? And whether God exists or not, in some sense, by the way, with regards to the metaphysics of this particular discussion, is not relevant. The point remains the same either way. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, that if you refuse to take on the responsibility yourself, and you attempt to lay it at the feet of either society or being itself, then you instantly start to act in a way that makes everything much worse, not only for you, but for everyone else, and maybe even for being itself. And so, no, it's not helpful. Now, if you decide that it's you've got the problem, maybe that's not even true. Like, maybe you are someone who's being tortured by the bet between God and Satan, and like, too bad for you if that happens to be the case. But it still seems to be the appropriate thing for a human being who's standing on his or her own 2 feet in a proper manner to take the responsibility on for themselves, regardless of the counter arguments that might be made against it. That's really something.